Welcome to the program, your weekly popular environment show on environment, Echo Show. I'm your host today, Filippo Sano. The topic for today is economic growth and environment. This topic is very important because today is just, we are on the eve of the major meeting on climate change that is starting tomorrow in Copenhagen, Denmark. But we will take time to discuss that topic on climate change later on after the Copenhagen meeting is over. We have with us in the studio, our guest for today is Dr. Kevin Urama. Dr. Urama is the Executive Director of the Africa Technology Policy Studies and is also the inaugural President of the African Society for Ecological Economics. Dr. Urama holds a PhD in Ecological Economics from Cambridge University and is also co-chair of the Steering Committee of the United Nations Environment Programme Global Climate Change Adaptation Network in Africa. Welcome to the studio, Dr. Urama.
Thank you very much.
The topic on economic growth and environment is a topic that is at the concern of major countries and major governments' development priority. We've just seen a clip and discussions by Professor Peter Brown, who is a renowned ecological economist at McGill University in Canada. Some of the issues that come up is that what is economic growth and how does economic growth relate to environment, and how big can the economy be?
Okay, thank you very much. As you said, the issue of economic growth and how this relates with the environment is certainly a very topical issue. It's also a very important issue for global sustainability. And the question you ask about what economic growth is, currently economic growth is measured in terms of gross domestic product called GDP. But this measure of economic growth has led to a lot of problems in terms of economic growth and policy trajectories of different countries. Because GDP measures the quantity of goods and services produced in a country at a particular time. And this measure does not really think about or include any aspects of environmental externalities, pollution, and also any other issues about equity and distribution of income. So you may find that an economy might be growing, the GDP index will be growing, and there's a lot of inequity, as you find in many countries, and also there's a lot of environmental degradation and use of natural resource base, which actually is sustaining the life support systems of the world.
What do you mean when you talk about externality? Maybe viewers might not be able to know what an externality is.
Okay, by externalities I simply mean implications of actions that are unintended. And these are actions, if I take an action and that has an impact on a third party, that's not part of my action, and also not aware of the implications, I didn't plan for it, and I also didn't plan for it, then it becomes external to the production process, and that's why we call it externality. It's something that happens outside the major goals and processes of the production. And a typical externality is pollution. If you consider, for instance, now I want to produce I have a textile industry and I'm producing clothes for sale. That's an economic good, and it can lead to growth in economic welfare of the people. But again, the effluent that comes from the production plants can go into the rivers and also pollute the rivers that people downstream are going to drink. And these people drinking it are not part of my production gains. And that impact of my production activity becomes an externality on that community. So that's an externality.
So how do you solve this problem? For example, you talk about pollution. If I take, for example, the case of Pan Paper Mill in Mbuye, which is one of the paper production plants in the country, and a lot of people live near the factory site or near the industrial site, actually suffer a lot from pollution, both in the rivers and in terms of the atmosphere. How do you correct for this problem? Do you have to penalize the company, or does the government have to come in and make a correction?
Now, the issue of externalities and how to correct externality problems, it's been a very topical debate in environmental and ecological economics. It's also been a key issue in terms of economic policy planning. There are different ways that within economics we think that if we try to internalize the externalities, which means if I cause the problem, if I cause the pollution, then I have to pay for the cleanup. And that is called polluter pays principle. Yeah. And with that principle, it means that when I'm trying to do any kind of production activity, I'm also thinking about the external impacts it would have in the community, and then I will be able to invest in cleanup. That's one way of internalizing externalities. Another way of internalizing externalities is actually to go through a cleaner production process so that I do not create that problem in the first instance. So in that clean development planning and clean technologies, and sometimes called smart technologies, it means that I'm producing that pepper mill. I'm still producing the same quantity of pepper with less externalities, with less pollution on the environment. And in current thinking, in environmental economics, you call that decoupling. Yeah. Environmental decoupling, that you are decoupling your production process from environmental pollution. Because in the world of technology and innovation, it is very possible that we can take better production processes and not create as much pollution as we are creating on the environment at the moment. There are also other ways which are actually better ways of reducing this pollution, which is actually to reduce the production of polluting effluents in the first instance. So if you take a production process that is going to reduce that pollution, the effluents from your industry that is causing the pollution, then you have reduced that pollution process in itself. You can also find ways of recycling the effluent, so that the effluents, the water effluents now that is carrying these pollutants, can go into another system where it becomes an input to another form of production. So in that way, the effluents becomes not waste, but actually becomes a secondary resource that can be used for further production. And that becomes a win-win scenario for the environment. And that's why you may have heard of this concept of the 3 R's. Yeah. The reduce, reuse, and recycle. And more recently, in the International Resource Panel to which I belong, we're also introducing a 4R concept, which is actually to refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle.
What's the first refuse?
The first refuse is that there are some kind of production processes that are not necessary, that we can find an alternative way of doing that. And in that case, you should be, the community and the society or the country should be able to refuse to follow that path of production in the first instance. And that way you have zero emissions, because you are not creating that problem in the first instance. But it's still a new concept that we're still exploring.
Thank you. We'll come back to the issue of technology a bit later in the program. But viewers, if you're just joining us, you are watching Echo Show program, your weekly environmental program on KBC. Remember, you can participate in this program in 2 ways. You can call directly with your questions to the following numbers: 020-343-988 or 020-342-367. You can also text in your questions to the following number: 0720-869-880. Remember, we will be happy to take your questions. Today with us in the studio, we have Dr. Kevin Urama, who is an ecological economics, and the topic of our discussion is economic growth and environment. So back to what you're talking about. Are you trying to suggest that there's no conflict between economic growth and environmental conservation? I've heard in a number of quarters people saying you either conserve the environment, or if you want to follow the path of economic growth as a country that is still developing, then there's no absolutely way you can do that without polluting the environment. And also just a brief comment about how you handle externalities. You must be aware that there's a law in Kenya that just come in place which talks about noise pollution. Would you think that people would be allowed, for instance, to, make a lot of noise and still be able to pay for it? Would that be something that's acceptable to the society?
Okay. Thank you very much. I think the issue, or the first issue you are raising about the nexus, the relationship between economic growth and the environment, is a very important one. It's also a very complex question to answer. It's not a yes or no answer, because it is possible, like I have demonstrated in the first question, answering the first question, it is possible to find smart technologies that you can grow while still not destroying the environment. And in that case, you are decoupling your growth from environmental pollution. But there's also the issue of economic decoupling, where you are trying also to reduce the amount of growth that you think it is necessary. So instead of trying to grow your GDP continuously without limits, then you are thinking of being able to provide the necessities of life and what the population needs in order to be able to live comfortably in good relationship with the ecosphere. Because the economy in itself is embedded in a larger system. And that larger system is the socio-ecological system, which in some spheres, in some discourses, we refer to as the ecosphere. And then the socio-ecological systems has only the economics as a simple subset of that system. If you consider yourself like in a spaceship, the things you do within the ship affects the rest of the system. So it is important that in growing our economies, we are thinking about the externalities. We're also thinking about the absolute need of the population, of the people we are trying to grow the economies for, so that we're not just growing one aspect of the economy, which is financial growth, measures of GDP, while we are also having negative growth, which Hamondeli calls uneconomic growth. In terms of when you are now growing the economy and destroying the ecosystem, then you are setting a trigger that with some time, in the very short or medium term even, you are going to have a collapse of the economy in itself. So you are not having positive growth, even though in the short term you think that you are growing. But in the longer run, in the shorter medium term, you are not really growing, because the cost of the externality, of cleaning of the externalities and the impact of these externalities on economic growth in itself limits that growth. If you think about this system where resources are flowing from the bioecological systems that's from the environment, from nature, let's use simple terms, natural resources, water, energy, sugar from photosynthesis is flowing from trees, plants, and the environment that sustains us. And it moves into production. So you are growing your farms because the soils are fertile, because you can get the water, because the trees can do photosynthesis and convert it into sugar. It becomes the fruits, the tubers that we eat. So the whole system are depending on this natural system. If you deplete that natural system in order to grow your output in the short term, it's not really...
Then you're depleting your capital.
You are depleting your natural capital, on which is actually the life support system that actually supports life on Earth.
But just before you comment on the noise pollution, I think part of what we've seen in the clip that we just watched, Professor Peter Brown, it seems that we have the technology, we have the know-how about how to have an economic growth that is not detrimental to the environment. But it appears that the problem lies with the decision. So who makes the decisions? I think we saw the fact that a lot of the decisions on economic growth and countries' development are made by, for example, people in the economic sector or people in the finance ministries. How can this be changed? And in what ways do people in environment, like you, who work on environment economies, be able to inform this development plan so that, you know, for example, I think a lot of African countries, Kenya included, Rwanda, have a lot of very good visions. You know, we have Vision 2030 in Kenya, Rwanda's Vision 2020. Other countries have different visions. But how do these visions take into account all the issues that you're talking about?
Okay. Now, the issue of how countries are growing at the moment is obviously requiring a complete rethinking. And that rethinking is because economic growth, measures of GDP, growing the financial base of countries, growing trade, growing consumption, growing production of goods and services within the country has taken the center stage without due considerations or concerns, but actually the source and the sink systems that sustains that growth pattern. So that is why you find that countries grow in the short term, but then within some, in a few years, you begin to find recession, begin to find collapses. We have had series of nature bouncing back, and then we have had series of economic financial systems also collapsing. Currently, we are in a recession globally. And this is because we are continuing to grow without really thinking about the other aspects that is important. And ways of trying to change this starts from awareness creation. The problems we have is because many countries are competing in terms of growing their GDP. And then because of growing GDP, and the focus is on growing GDP, all these other aspects are actually only talked about very recently, but not actually being taken into consideration in terms of policy planning. So there's a lot of awareness creation going on, and if you consider the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, then you find that the research, the knowledge generation that they have done has helped a lot of countries to now begin to awaken to the implications of climate change on the economy in itself. And like you said in the beginning, at COP15, there's going to be these discussions on what countries should do. So awareness creation, knowledge generation, knowledge sharing becomes very, very important. Again, creating alternative measures for growth in terms of smart technologies, innovations, and all these things becomes very important in beginning to try to change the trajectories of growth and economic policy planning of nations.
Great. We're going to take a short break. Welcome back to Echo Show. Our topic for today is economic growth and environment, and we have with us Dr. Kevin Urama, an ecological economist, discussing this topic. Yes, Dr. Urama, just before the break, we were talking about this issue of externalities, but then back to the bigger picture. How big should an economy be? How can we have economic growth without a limit, or is there a limit to economic growth, even if you take into account all the measures that we are talking about?
Okay. The issue of growing economies, like I said before, has been a tricky one. In the past 30, 40 years, because of growth in capitalist thinking, there's been this presumption that when you grow GDP, the welfare of citizens will also grow. And because there is no concern for how this impacts on the environment and the life support systems, there has been generally within the economic paradigms the assumption that economies can grow oxymoronically. They can grow continuously without limits. But again, there has been a series of warnings. The Club of Rome in 1972 talked about the limits to growth. Even Malthus talked about the population trap, and different ways of trying to warn that we cannot continue to grow without limits. Because the ecosystem in itself, modern nature, if I use that term, actually has limits in itself. It has finite resources. It's not infinite. And because of that, that's the level to which you can extract these resources for production in the economic system. There's a limit to which also you can put wastes into the sink functions of the natural systems. So if you continue, for instance, if I talk about a piece of land, and you want to grow crops in it, and you increase the production of crops from this piece of land, harvesting the soil fertility of the land, at some point you find that the crops will just stop growing.
Because
it cannot draw the energy from the soils anymore in terms of resources, fertility in order to grow. So that tells us simply that growing economies must have limits. And when does it become too big? The answer to the question is really very simple. It becomes too big when it begins to deplete its own nest. It's like a bird fouling its own nests. So you are just drawing yourself to an end. So if the economy is growing to an extent that the externalities of growth becomes more than the positive impacts of growth on the society for which it is being grown, then it has gone beyond the limits that is expected. But the most unfortunate thing is that the global economic system at the moment is way beyond the limits of the natural support.
So we have already overshot what?
We have already overshot our economic throughput, what we can actually draw from the natural system. But then that overshooting is also not well distributed, because you have some economies that have overgrown, some economies that are yet to grow to its optimal limits, and there are some economies that are near its optimal limits. And that is where the issues of ethics becomes important. the issues of distribution becomes important. Distribution of incomes becomes important. And also some forms of global controls on how we extract from these natural systems also becomes important. But at the moment, the concept of growth is that you grow, and as long as you are growing, welfare is increasing.
Yeah, and all the countries are competing to outgrow each other, I think. It's a kind of a competition game that you have here.
Yeah, the competition game we have is something that is anchored on this concept of how we measure growth. Because as long as we continue to measure growth by gross domestic product, GDP, increases in GDP, countries are going to continue to want to grow their GDPs. And because the growth in GDPs is simply talking about the quantity of goods and services produced and consumed in a country, then there is no concern for the ecosystem in itself.
So, two very important things that come out from your response. I think one is the issue of fairness, and I think we've seen the discussion here. I think even in countries, economies that have overgrown, as you say, we are seeing a lot of skewness in terms of wealth distribution. And even in countries that are still growing, we are seeing some part of this wealth kind of being held by just a few groups of people. And these are the least who control the decision making. But also the second thing that I would like you to comment about that viewers will be interested in is the issue of population, because I think that comes out very as an important factor. I think we've seen a lot of policies where they're trying to limit population. Is limiting population an answer, or is it just one of the things about ethics that we are not getting right?
Okay. The issue of population is central, and in my first response I referred to Malthusian theory of population, where he was warning about the impending limits, that the populations of countries are outgrowing its resources, and the simple theory that the population trap is actually going to stop that from happening. So population is certainly a very central factor in economic policy planning. And this is also one of the reasons why national governments are finding it difficult even to control environmental externalities, to think about how to manage the ecosystem and also the social infrastructure of countries. If you take Nairobi, where we are in, for instance, when Nairobi was planned, the population of Nairobi is not as big as it is now. So the social infrastructure that was put in place for that has now been outstripped by influx of people, by growth in the number of people living in that area. And it puts stress on the infrastructure that is there. If you take that analogy to the ecosystem, the more we grow our population, we are predicted to be up to 9 billion in a few years. Currently, by 2050. We are currently just about 6 billion, and we're having all these problems and resource wars that we're finding everywhere because the resources we have access to is limited, and the number of people who are seeking to consume those resources is limited. Then that's one issue. But there's also the issue of equity in it. The ethics of how resources are used is also there. Because you know that even within countries, there's a huge maldistribution in income and access to these resources. So because of that poor distribution and unfair distribution in access to resources, some people have so much of income, so much of access to natural resources that certainly they don't need to that extent, while others do not have access to basic resources that they need for day-to-day survival. And
is this because of capitalism, or?
It is because of the fact that the current economic systems we have has no measure of fairness. There is no way of measuring distribution of incomes. There's no way of measuring what is fair or what is not fair. Even the definition of what is fair is contextualized in the different dialogues that you have. So because now, and because we do not see this spaceship Earth, where all of us are part of a system, and the more I try to disadvantage that system, then that is the more it's also going to affect me in the longer or shorter or longer run. So there's a lot of intra-generational inequity and also intergenerational inequity. So people are growing today and increasing GDP today, increasing individual wealth and capital today without actually thinking about the environment, thinking about the system that supports all of us. And that lack of concern for the global commons is the cause of the fact that countries are seeking to grow, individuals are seeking to grow, and no one is really thinking effectively on how that impacts on the rest of the population, the rest of the society, and so on. So my answer to population then are in two ways.
Yeah.
One, controlling population is certainly a useful factor.
Yeah.
But that is not all, because actually within the population of every country, the actual population that is causing the problem is actually minute. A lot of the people in many countries are not actually accessing resources beyond their limit. Few are accessing beyond their limit.
Too much
more than they should have access to.
Yeah.
So their ecological footprints is very high.
Yeah.
But then, because in the current measures we are using the mean, so if you are looking for per capita income, you get the average, and that average maybe is $50,000.
Yeah.
And there are people there in that country who are living under $1 a day.
Yeah.
So it's not a good measure. And because of this individualistic measure, countries, individuals, companies are all seeking to grow their profits, grow their throughputs, and so on. But that lack of proper distribution causes a lot of problems. We have civil unrest, we have wars, we have all kinds of resource wars going on.
Yeah, we'll come back to the issue of ethics. Viewers, you are watching Echo Show, and remember, you can participate. We encourage you to call in with your questions on the following numbers: 020-343-988 or 020-342-367. You can also send SMS through the 0720-869-880. And the topic for discussion today is economic growth and environment. When I talk about ethics, I think what measures are being put in place? Is there an ethical framework that countries or corporations or individuals can refer to, or is it we have to go to the extent where we just have to use what we call command and control, put in very strict measures and laws, or are there economic incentives in economic framework where we can be able to use to be able to sort of shift this trajectory? Because I think that's perhaps where the solution would lie.
There has been a lot of resolutions and declarations, both at the global levels and also at national levels. Countries have lots of visions and policies that has been put in place in order to begin to think about the environment and begin to think of how to control our impacts on the environment. The COP15 meeting, which is happening next week, is one of that, where the world is gathering together to think about what to do in order to cut CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
And these things are very important, but the problem is that we have talks and less actions. So if you're asking about whether there are systems in place to control this, yes, there are systems in place. We have had the Rio Declaration, we have had series of declarations in the past, but to the extent to which this is being put into practice is still questionable.
So that's a problem. And I think when you talk about the COP meeting, it's on climate change, but I think climate change is part of the problem that we see with the global commons. Yeah. But we also have other problems that don't seem to be catching media attention. I think the world global fisheries is collapsing, and nobody's talking about that. And I think in part of what we saw from Professor Brown's comment was the issue of putting in a governance system where you have a trusteeship so that all these environmental commons, or as we call them, global commons, can be put to one organization, for example, whether it's the United Nations or something like that, and then they'll be able to regulate how much countries can be able to use. Is that feasible in economic terms? Is it something that people in environment economists or ecological economists have been thinking about?
Yeah, there's been a lot of thinking in terms of how the global community can begin first to recognize that we have a commonwealth of life. Yeah. And that commonwealth of life needs to be managed. And also to recognize that the ecosystem knows no boundaries. It doesn't know that this is Kenya or Uganda or America. And the case of climate change, which you just mentioned, is a very clear example where some countries have emitted huge amounts of CO2, and that is causing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and causing problems for the ecosystem. And then the impacts of this climate change scenario is actually being felt or predicted to be felt first and most by the countries, less developed countries, that has emitted very minute levels of CO2 emissions.
Yeah.
That simply tells us that we are living in a spaceship, and my actions affects the actions of the other person in Ghana, the other person in Lesotho, the other person in Mozambique, the other person in China. And one of the first things that I personally would like us to begin to see is that interconnectedness between nations, between individuals, the interconnectedness between me and the tree in the Mao forest, the interconnections between me and the river and everything, so that we can all begin to think about the commonwealth of life, so that there is some form of distribution of how resources flow. Yeah. And then in that case...
Can I ask a question? I think there's a question coming in, so I'll take it. Go ahead. Who's calling?
If our economy is put at one bar and the environment at one bar, can they grow at the same growth?
Who is calling? Could you please let us know your name and where you're calling from?
Kogo Kimutai Hillary from Jamase, Aldai, Nandi South.
So Kogo Kimutai, you got the question.
Yes.
Whether if you put economy and environment in the same bar, can they grow at the same pace?
Okay. Now, if that's where we started with this, that it is possible to decouple environmental degradation from economic growth. And it is also possible to decouple economic growth in itself, absolutely. Because the economy, like I've mentioned before, is growing as a subset of the ecosystem. And that ecosphere is from where resources flow for production in the economic system.